Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to today's webinar, which is the second presentation in the webinar series of the Blackout Hate Project, titled Combating Hate Within the Confines of the Charter. My name is Natasha Daly, and I'll be today's presenter. I am a lawyer and registered social worker, and I currently work on the Blackout Hate Project alongside Don Parchment and Adrian Leckie. The objective of today's presentation is to empower yourself and your community. The Blackout Hate Project is an initiative created and hosted by the BLAC Legal Action Centre, funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage in the Government of Canada. Now, while this presentation is made possible through the support of these organizations, the views and opinions expressed within this presentation are solely those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the Government of Canada or Canadian Heritage as an organization. As a disclaimer, neither Canadian Heritage nor the Government of Canada assumes any responsibility for the content of today's presentation. And as a personal disclaimer, just to cover myself, today's presentation is a general discussion on legal concepts, but it is not intended to be taken as legal advice. It also doesn't create a lawyer-client relationship between myself and any of you as the participants. Please also be advised that today's presentation is being recorded and may be published online. I'd also like to give a land acknowledgement, noting that we are on the ancestral traditional territories of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, and in particular the Mississauga of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. It is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Toronto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area that I'm currently residing in, called Toronto or the Greater Toronto Area, and its surrounding areas are still home to many Indigenous people. I am grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. And I also acknowledge the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will, and made to work on these lands. Indigenous sovereignty is deeply and inextricably linked to Black liberation, and I will continue to mobilize and take action in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities, and I encourage us all to do the same. For today's presentation, we also welcome your participation. The audience will remain muted during the presentation today, but we will leave room for questions in the chat. You can put anything in the chat at any time, but specifically a Q&A section will be had at the end of the session for any further more substantive questions that you may have. If you have any technical issues or questions throughout, please private message our host named the BLAC Legal Action Center or the other co-host that can help with any tech issues, titled as tech support, which you'll see in the participants drop-down list. We ask that you please remain respectful in the chat at all times, as any rude or offensive language will result in removal from the presentation. We also will be using Mentimeter for audience participation. And so sometimes when it comes to presentations in the virtual space, it can kind of be a lot of feeling like we're kind of just talking at you, but we want this to be interactive. And so we're going to be using Mentimeter. So I encourage you to pull out your phone and either go to menti.com on your web, or you can scan the QR code there. And throughout the presentation, when I prompt you to visit Mentimeter, I invite you to do that so that we can have your audience participation as we go. And there'll also be an opportunity for you to evaluate the session at the end. So let's get right into it. As an introduction and an overview, today we are going to be discussing the realities of anti-Black hate in Canada and the rise of anti-Black hate groups in our communities. While anti-Black racism and systemic racism are topics often discussed, the focus of this project series is on addressing anti-Black hate in particular, which differs slightly from anti-Black racism. Our focus is to help you identify when an instance of anti-Black hate has occurred, how to cope with it, overcome it, and ultimately report it so we can move closer toward having communities that are more safe for everybody, but importantly also for Black people. Because we can't fully stop anti-Black hate or anti-Black racism overnight, it's important to increase our ability, both individually and collectively as a community, to fight against it and try hard to promote our wellness when we experience anti-Black hate. One of the ways we can fight against anti-Black hate is by properly understanding two key sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we'll discuss tonight. The Charter is a legal document that became part of Canada's Constitution when our country decided how it wanted to run itself. It is supposed to guarantee the fundamental rights and freedoms of all people in Canada and gives us an opportunity to get some kind of legal remedy when our rights and freedoms have been violated. Importantly, for today's presentation, it also creates limits on our freedoms that some people, such as those who join white supremacist groups or other kinds of hate groups, use to perpetuate anti-Black hate. The Charter applies to all public institutions like your school, universities, and even hospitals. For the purposes of today's presentation, we won't discuss every single right and freedom, and we won't go into too much detail, but we will discuss two of the main freedoms that we think you should know about in order to combat anti-Black hate within the confines of the Charter. Second, we will also briefly discuss some sections of the Criminal Code, which governs how hate crimes are handled across the country, as well as some of the legal pathways available there. Now let's discuss the distinction between anti-Black racism and anti-Black hate. The difference between the two lies in the severity and nature of the conduct. Anti-Black racism is defined as prejudice, attitudes, beliefs, stereotyping, and discrimination directed at people of African descent, rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement and its legacy. It is deeply embedded in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices, and is often normalized or deemed invisible to the larger white society. Anti-Black racism is present in social, economic, educational, and political structures, leading to unequal opportunities and outcomes for Black people. While anti-Black racism shows up as discrimination through sometimes expressed, but more often in Canada, subtle or unconscious biases, anti-Black hate refers to extreme forms of expression or motivation that meet a higher legal threshold of detestation or vilification. While racism can be the underlying motivation for hate speech, not all discriminatory speech or acts of racism will be considered hate. Generally speaking, hate crimes are criminal acts motivated by extreme bias or hatred towards a particular social group. We will get more into hate crimes in the criminal code later on. Now, there's also a distinction between hate incidents and hate crimes. A hate incident is a non-criminal action or behavior that is motivated by hate against an identifiable group. Examples of hate incidents include using racial slurs or insulting a person because of their ethnic or religious dress or how they identify. For example, a dispute in a parking lot, which then escalates to verbal abuse, derogatory or racial slurs. These incidents are very harmful and lead to emotional and psychological stress. On the other hand, a hate crime is a criminal offense committed against a person or property, motivated in whole or in part by hate, bias, or prejudice against an identifiable group. An identifiable group may be distinguished by race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, your sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression. So this means that acts of violence, even the uttering of threats, for example, involved in many anti-Black hate incidents can rise to the level of a hate crime. To help us further distinguish, let's look at a few key indicators of when a hate crime may be present as opposed to just a hate incident. The police will also look into when you do report. They'll consider one, the different comments that were made during the offense. They'll also look at the motivation of the perpetrator or even a lack of an apparent motive. So thinking about, okay, why did this person act in this way? And if there's no other explanation other than the fact that they have hatred toward this identifiable group that the victim is a part of, then that will lean toward them believing and understanding and investigating the issue as a hate crime. They'll also look at the victim's perception that they were targeted. So even if no racial slurs were used, but if you are the victim or whoever the victim is, if they believe, based on the totality of the circumstances, that they were targeted because of them being Black or them being a Black Muslim or a Black woman, that is something that they will also consider your own perception about whether or not you felt like you were targeted based on your race or your membership in an identifiable group. They'll also look for the display of hate symbols, gestures, or language. So for example, when it comes down to the Black community. In the past, when we think about civil rights movement, we also think about just the history of enslavement and practices that took place with Black people. The symbol of a noose, which was often used to hang Black people in public. For example, if that symbol is shown in maybe an online chat space, or if someone physically ties one and threatens you with it, that's something that the police would take into account in the investigation that would lean towards this being a hate crime and not just a criminal offense against you in general. You'd also want to consider the manner in which the offense was committed, if there's any recurring patterns of harassment, humiliation, or intimidation. So let's say this isn't something that just happened once to you, but you have maybe a neighbor or a group of people in your neighborhood and they've done this multiple times. The police will also take into account the pattern. And then there's certainly several other relevant circumstances surrounding the offense. Looking at the criminal code lists and defines a wide range of crimes, setting the legal standard for what is considered a criminal act across the entire country. There are three main sections of the criminal code that deal with hate crimes in particular, and that can address an instance of anti-Black hate. There's Section 318, which deals with advocating genocide, Section 319 sub 1, which deals with public incitement of hatred, and there's Section 319 sub 2, which deals with the willful promotion of hatred. Context is extremely important in these kinds of hate propaganda and hate crime investigations. And ultimately, with the exception of police incitement of hatred, the police have to get consent from the Attorney General of Canada prior to charging someone with a hate crime. So there is a process under the criminal code for charging someone with a hate crime, and it can kind of get a bit complex at that point. But what's important, I think, for us to know today is that, one, hate crimes are covered under the criminal code, and these are things that we should be reporting so that police and other justice system participants can get involved so that justice can be done. When we look at anti-Black hate as a criminal offense, almost any type of criminal offense can be motivated by hate. For example, hate crime offenses may include acts of violence or hostility, such as an assault, like hitting or spitting on someone, or causing damage to someone's property, like a Black-owned beauty supply store. The key is that these acts intentionally target individuals or property based on the offender's hate towards the identifiable group. So when criminal acts are perpetuated against Black people or property that's designated for the use or advancement of the Black community, which are motivated by hatred toward them based on the color of their skin or ethnicity, that is when it would rise to the level of being considered a hate crime and should be reported as such. The criminal code also allows for increased penalties to be imposed on offenders for any offense that is motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate. In these instances, the focus for determining hatred at that level is on the likely effect of the expression on its audience, specifically whether it is likely to expose the targeted group or person to that feeling and that emotion of being detested, being hated, abuse, vilification by the perpetrators or by others. Now, that was a lot of information, so let's quickly recap. Looking at the photo on the screen, if you have a criminal offense and there's some level of hate that is attached, whether it's through a racial slur or some other indicator that we discussed, then it's likely that you have a hate crime. If there's a criminal offense, but there's no indication of hate involved, then it's likely just a criminal offense, not just because it's not small that's happening, but it wouldn't rise to the level of a hate crime. It would be considered a criminal offense. And if you have hate, so someone is using a racial slur or one of the other indicators that we discussed, but there's no criminal offense element to it, then what we have is a hate incident. Over the last several years, there has also been a significant increase in hate crimes across the country. Let's take a quick look at this video where they discuss it a bit in depth.
We were talking a little earlier about the Prime Minister and a big announcement today in Toronto surrounded by RCMP officers getting tough on crime, saying it's time for a crackdown. That comes as we're getting some new data on the rise of hate crimes in our country. CTV's Scott Hurst is standing by with the latest on what we're seeing and the number of incidents nationwide.
And Todd, the government is also proposing new legislation that would crack down on hate crimes across the country. As over the past several years, Canada has seen a steady and troubling rise in the number of police-reported hate crimes, leaving too many people feeling unsafe in their communities and at places of worship. A majority of the reported crimes, as you're seeing by this graphic here, targeting groups for their race, ethnicity, or religion, with Canada seeing a troubling surge specifically in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. New preliminary numbers out this morning by Stats Canada are showing more than 2,200 police-reported hate crimes so far this year, a very similar number to what was reported for the first half of last year, and still overall reflecting a significant spike over the past several years. The number of reported incidents so far this year still more than all of 2019, with a nearly 50% increase in reported hate crimes over the past 2 years. And according to the government data, Black, Jewish, and Muslim communities are the most frequently targeted groups overall last year. And it's putting many communities on high alert, as well as police departments trying to combat acts of violence, vandalism, and intimidation. This says Ottawa, under pressure to stem the rising tide of hate, has introduced new legislation, as I mentioned, the Combating Hate Act, proposing 4 new criminal offenses. However, there are concerns from civil liberties groups, including the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, that the proposed legislation goes too far, Todd, and could infringe on the rights of Canadians.
All right, CTV's Scott Hurst. Thanks for this, Scott.
Thanks, Todd.
Now, as we heard in that video, there is certainly a rise in hate crimes in general across the country, but we're particularly seeing an increase in hate crimes committed against members of the Black community, the Jewish community, and the Islamic community, as was discussed. Looking at the graphic that's beside us here, we see that over 45% of reported hate crimes are based on an individual's membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. So when we think about today's presentation, when we're looking at anti-Black hate, not only are we seeing the rise, but we're also needing to understand how we should be reporting these incidents and how we can take care of ourselves in the midst of this climate that we're living in. So let's take a deeper look at what anti-Black hate looks like in the news. Just last month, CBC News reported on an incident of anti-Black hate that took place in Hamilton. A 20-year-old woman was walking in the Meadowlands area of Hamilton near Gulf Links Road and Neville Drive on the night of October 25th. A car with unknown individuals, unknown to her, approached her. The people inside shouted anti-Black racial slurs at her and then physically assaulted her before driving away. Now, based on that information, this is an opportunity for you to participate in the chat. Based on the distinctions that we just discussed, which category would this fall under and why? Do you believe that it is a hate incident, simply a criminal offense, or does this rise potentially to the level of a hate crime? I'll give you a few moments in the chat to place your answers. And everyone's getting it right on the nail, hitting the nail right on the head, which means that I'm doing a good job and you guys are paying attention, which I appreciate. This situation is certainly being treated as a hate crime because of 3 main things. 1, the attack included explicit anti-Black racial slurs. The assault appears to have been motivated by the racial bias, which is a legally recognized bias for a hate-motivated offense, especially given the fact that these people were strangers to her, so any other apparent motive is absent. And the racial slurs, plus the fact that they hit her, that would be the assault, which would bring it to the level of being a hate crime and not just a hate incident. The racial slurs also show that the woman was targeted because of her identity as a Black person, which turns a regular assault into a hate-motivated assault under the criminal code. In this particular circumstance, what was done? Because the incident was reported, the Hamilton police were able to open a hate crime investigation. And later on in the article, we see that the police were also requesting community help with getting security footage and asking witnesses to share information. The Hamilton Police Service also has a particular group called the Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center, which encourages community reporting and urged anyone with information to contact Crime Stoppers or report hate incidents through their WeSupportHamilton.ca tool. All of this demonstrates in real time how and why we should report these incidents when they occur. Looking at the next slide, it's important that we do report, and reporting is something that we will discuss at a later point in our presentation today. This picture is from the article that we just discussed, which highlights the importance of reporting. It notes here that in 2024, the Hamilton police reported 106 hate crimes. However, they also logged 191 hate incidents, which police describe as incidents with hateful overtones that didn't necessarily meet the legal threshold for a hate crime. The number of reported hate crimes was the highest in at least a decade. And again, we saw here that those 106 hate crimes were hate or bias was indeed a clear motivating factor. And so when it comes down to reporting, sometimes it is about the steps that the police are going to take and the investigation and them charging. But what's also important about reporting is that the data is now being collected. And with that data, that's now why we're seeing, as was mentioned in the video, Canada and the legislature and those who make laws wanting to be able to now say, okay, we now have this data. What can we do about it to support our communities and to make things safer? But if we don't report, the people that are making the laws and policies won't know what's really happening on the ground. So now let's dive a bit into the charter. The importance of diving into the charter so that you'll be able to know when something should be reported from a charter standpoint. The key sections of the charter that we'll discuss will be section 2B and 2C, known as the freedom of expression or freedom of speech, and the freedom of assembly provisions. We'll focus only on these two for today because knowing them can help us combat anti-Black hate when we encounter it. For each of these sections, I will be giving a very simplified overview to help you understand the basics of the freedom, as well as the limits imposed on them, as no right or freedom under the Charter is absolute. The Charter has what's called reasonable limits. These are limits that are placed on all Charter rights and freedoms, which are imposed by Section 1 of the Charter, which states that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, that's a lot of legal jargon, but the importance here is to note that ultimately, every reasonable limit that is assigned to a charter right or a charter freedom is intended to balance the rights of the individual and the interests of society by imposing those limits. Now, these limits are guided by certain values and principles that Canada is supposed to stand for, such as the inherent human dignity that everyone is born with and worthy of in this country, a commitment to social justice and equality, accommodation of a variety of beliefs, particularly because we live in such a diverse country, and a respect for cultural and group identity. Looking at Section 2B first, that is the freedom of expression, or it's also known as the freedom of speech. And that provision says that everyone has the freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom to the press and other media of communication. This is often referred to in the community as freedom of speech, which means that everyone has the right to freely express their thoughts, beliefs, and opinions by any form of communication. However, this definitely is one of our rights that is subject to a reasonable limit. First, what does expression mean? An expression is any activity or communication that intends to send a message or attempts to send a message. The courts have also applied the principle of neutrality, which means that the content of what is being expressed, no matter how offensive, unpopular, or disturbing, doesn't necessarily stop the expression from being protected by the Charter. One of the reasons why the law protects freedoms of expression is to encourage the process of fulfilling our complete potential as people, which involves personal growth, self-awareness, and pursuing our authenticity, creativity, and purpose. But the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech is not intended to promote hate. And that's why there is indeed a limit on it. The law is very clear that expressions that take the form of violence or threats of violence are not protected by the Charter. Hate speech, for example, isn't allowed because it attempts to marginalize people based on their membership in a particular group, which can lead to serious attacks on vulnerable populations, as we see with hate crimes and anti-Black hate that's perpetuated in our society. And this is why laws prohibiting hate speech are considered a reasonable limit on our freedom of expression. The criminal code also acts as a limit to the freedom of expression. There are multiple provisions in the criminal code that were mentioned earlier that criminalize certain expressions or conduct that promote and provoke hatred toward another group or person. Therefore, expressions of anti-Black hate are not protected by the freedom of speech. So if anyone uses, I have the freedom of speech, or I'm exercising my freedom of expression, when they are actually perpetuating anti-Black hate, you can advocate for yourself and others in that moment and let them know that hate speech and hate crimes are actually not protected under the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression provisions. Looking at Section 2C, which is the freedom of peaceful assembly, that provision states that everyone has the freedom of peaceful assembly. Now, the purpose of this freedom is intended to protect the physical gathering together of people in general. However, the reason or purpose of the gathering is not protected by the Charter. It's just the physical gathering of people itself. The freedom of assembly is closely related to the freedom of expression and has been viewed by the courts as speech in action. This includes the right to participate in peaceful demonstrations, protests, parades, meetings, and even picketing, like when we see certain groups going on strike, and other kinds of assemblies. However, it is important to keep in mind that Section 2C guarantees the right to peaceful assembly, peaceful being the key word, which means that it does not protect people engaging in riots and gatherings that seriously disturb the peace in any given area of society. The right to peaceful assembly does protect white supremacist gatherings, but this protection ends when their activities constitute criminal behavior, such as inciting hatred or violence. This is because even speech and assembly that are considered rude or offensive are initially protected by the Charter. So the fact that they are gathering is protected by the Charter, but they lose that Charter protection once they start engaging in criminal behavior or perpetuating hate while they are gathering. And as mentioned earlier, the criminal code criminalizes things like hate propaganda, which often apply to the activities of white supremacists and hate gatherings. Hate propaganda is defined in the criminal code as any writing, sign, or visible representation that advocates or promotes genocide or the communication of which by any person. And so it's important to note in that moment that if we see a group or a hate group in our neighborhoods or in our communities, they have the right to gather, but not once their behavior begins to go into that criminal behavior aspect, which we discussed earlier in today's presentation. So if they now are holding signs that have racial slurs on them or that are displaying some sort of anti-Black language or imaging, that conduct is no longer being protected by the freedom of assembly and should be reported. So let's actually talk about reporting and what to do when you encounter anti-Black hate in your community. Number one is to get to a place where you are physically safe. Your physical safety remains your top priority. Once you're in a place where you're physically safe, the next thing you want to do is call the police and report the incident. Hate incidents can escalate and prompt retaliatory actions. And so something that may have started off not as physically serious or detrimental to other members in the community around can easily escalate into something more, and police should be alerted as soon as possible. Hate-motivated crimes also have a long-lasting and serious side effect on society as a whole, but also on the individuals involved. So if you're in an emergency situation, certainly you want to call 911. To report a hate crime or a hate incident that isn't an emergency, you can call your local police service. Now, I don't know where all of you are tuning in from, but if you are in the Toronto region, you would want to call the Toronto Police Service, and their phone number is on the screen, 416-808-2222. And also to report crimes anonymously in Toronto. So if you don't want to be involved in the investigation process, if anything goes to court and you don't want to be involved in that process, but you still believe that what you just witnessed or experienced should be reported, you can do so anonymously in Toronto by calling 416-222-8477, or you can go online and report it at 222tips.com. The next thing you want to make sure you're doing is documenting and protecting the evidence if safe to do so. So that could look like taking pictures of the gathering or the signs that you may see, or if you yourself experienced any injuries to your body, feel free to take a picture of those as well to preserve that in case that it is needed for further investigation. The other thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that you report the exact phrases that were used in the encounter, like if they did use racial slurs or things they said to you, and all of the relevant details, which we'll discuss in a few moments. The next thing you want to do is make sure that you're not engaging physically with the perpetrators. That can be difficult when you yourself are witnessing it happen either to someone you know or someone you care about, or when it's happening to you yourself in that moment. Certainly do what you need to do to get yourself safe. So if it's a moment where you need to operate in self-defense, do so. But if it's not something where you're physically being attacked in any way, we want to encourage you to not engage with the perpetrators directly and rather get to a place where you yourself are safe. Because at that point, if you do engage or retaliate against them, you could still be open to some sort of criminal charges or allegations. And that's something that you yourself also want to avoid as a member of the Black community. And last but certainly not least, you want to ensure that you're seeking support for yourself. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly as well, regarding what that support could look like for you. When it comes down to reporting, you want to make sure that you are providing to the best of your ability in that moment the who, the what, the where, and the when. You also want to make sure that you're emphasizing the perceived threat or safety to your own personal integrity or the integrity or the safety of the identifiable group that you believe was being targeted in that moment. An example is here on the screen, and this is an example of what it might sound like if I just witnessed an incident of anti-Black hate in my community and I'm calling the police or I'm on the phone with them and I'm making the report. I would say something like, a group of about 15 white men and women are walking around my neighborhood near Queen Street and Elm Street this afternoon. They are yelling racial slurs at each Black person that walks by, threatening us and chanting, "Go back to your country." One of the men also punched my dad, a Black man, when he was trying to tell them to stop as they were standing outside of our house. I fear for our safety, and I am worried this situation will escalate. That last sentence that says, I fear for our safety and I'm worried this situation will escalate, is really important because at that point, that this type of language of you emphasizing how you're feeling and the threat and the fear that's coming up is important when you're reporting a hate crime because it gives them a sense of the urgency of the situation. And again, elevating it from being a hate incident to actually being a hate crime so that it can be reported as such. This same advice would apply to when incidents happen at your workplace or even at your school. Employers and school administrators have a responsibility to address incidents of hate that take place in spaces that are under their watch. So you always want to seek out a person in authority that you can make the report to. Now, we've talked a lot about what to do legally, but let's change gears a bit to discuss what actually happens to us as people when we experience anti-Black hate, so we know how to cope with it and how to ultimately overcome it and to heal from it. The reality is that the long history and present-day exposure to anti-Black racism and anti-Black hate has a large impact on the overall health and well-being of Black people. This is called racial trauma. Racial trauma refers to the mental and emotional injury resulting from racism, racial discrimination, stereotypes, hate crimes, and other race-related stressors experienced directly or indirectly. Direct racial trauma is when the incident happens to you, whereas indirect racial trauma stems from when you witness it against someone else, especially those that you identify with. So when you see another Black man or another Black woman or another Black person experiencing anti-Black hate, that also has an impact on us, even when we ourselves are not the direct people that are being targeted in that moment. In order to better understand and heal from the holistic impact of anti-Black hate, we need to look at racial trauma from what's called a biopsychosocial perspective. The biopsychosocial model helps us holistically understand a person's well-being and their challenges by integrating the biological, which is our bodies, the psychological, which is our mind, and social and environmental factors, which are the things that happen around us. Experiencing anti-Black hate has an impact on us biologically in multiple ways. A large component of the biological impact starts with what's called the amygdala, which is a structure in your brain responsible for processing emotions such as fear, anxiety, and also recognizing danger. It attaches emotional significance to memories and is involved in forming new memories related to our survival. The amygdala is known as the fear center of the brain, and it helps you identify when you're in danger and helps your body respond appropriately to help you survive. Your brain, in an effort to protect you, recognizes patterns of threats to help you respond quicker to a potential threat, increasing your chances of survival. Our bodies respond to anti-Black hate by triggering the amygdala because it recognizes it as a threat to our lives, safety, and well-being. It's also important to note that our brains don't immediately know the difference between an incident happening and us thinking that an incident is happening. For example, a lion chasing us versus us thinking that a lion is actually chasing us. Our physical bodies, our biological bodies might actually still respond in similar ways. For example, we may still experience a racing heartbeat, sweaty palms, or feeling our body become tense in the situation where even if it's not happening and we think it might be happening because our amygdala has recognized potential threat. We see this could happen if, because we are seeing and we're being inundated by anti-Black hate in the news and white supremacist groups popping up in different places. What this means is that biologically, our minds know and have that knowledge. And let's say we're walking in the neighborhood and we see a group of white people that have signs and they're yelling something, but we can't fully exactly hear what it is. Our bodies may still physically respond in that moment because the racial trauma is showing, hey, that actually might be a white supremacist group. You might actually want to stay away. Psychologically, experiencing racial trauma impacts the way we think and process information, both about ourselves and others. For example, if your brain perceives a threat due to anti-Black hate, we may become hypervigilant and look for ways to mitigate potential threats. We may experience intrusive thoughts, lower self-confidence, or self-esteem, especially when we enter predominantly non-Black spaces. Socially, racial trauma also impacts the way that we interact with each other and society at large. For example, there are some times where Black people may feel the need to code switch when they're in predominantly white spaces, or sometimes a young Black man may slightly raise the pitch of his voice when speaking to non-Black people so that he doesn't seem aggressive or intimidating and in some way cause someone to, not cause, but in some way then, someone else perpetuating anti-Black hate against him, he might start behaving in a particular kind of way or avoiding certain spaces altogether, which would be known as social anxiety or social withdrawal. It's important to keep in mind that everyone responds differently to racial trauma. And it's normal and expected that we would be impacted by racial trauma, and it doesn't mean that there is something wrong with us. Our body, mind, and emotions are simply reacting to legitimate and real threats against our safety. However, prolonged responses to racial trauma without effective coping strategies and healing can lead to poor health outcomes. But the good news is that there is hope for healing. The good thing is that once you're able to identify and name what's going on, you're then able to develop healthy coping mechanisms to help you heal and support others in their healing journey as well. So what does that healing process actually look like? It's about the story you tell yourself. Experiencing anti-Black hate is not just about the trauma of the incident itself, but it's also the story you tell yourself about what just happened to you or what you just witnessed. Sometimes the stories we begin to tell ourselves happen at an unconscious level. So we're not even consciously aware of this belief or this thought or this narrative that's forming, but becoming more mindful of the narratives and beliefs that we've created based on our life experiences is one way we can begin to heal from the effects of racial trauma. And so let's explore this a bit together. I want to hear from all of you on this one. After you experience an incident of anti-Black hate, we want to explore, how do you feel in that moment? What are some thoughts that come to mind? And I want you to put your responses in the Mentimeter space. Angry, absolutely, that's completely valid. And I think many can relate to that. Scared. Yep. So there's that fear coming in. Angry and violated. Totally valid. In disbelief. That's a very common one as well, just in terms of recognizing the shock. Like, did this really just happen? Did I really just see this just now? I definitely resonate with that. Okay. Thank you all so much for sharing. All of these initial emotional reactions and narratives are completely normal. However, in order to heal from racial trauma and overcome anti-Black hate, it's important that we begin to challenge the stories that we tell ourselves, even while we're experiencing these emotions. Because overcoming anti-Black hate does have two main components. One, the story we tell yourself, and then two, how we choose to cope with it. So when we experience that anger, when we experience that disbelief, it's also important to think about and to be intentional about how we're going to cope with that anger so that our bodies can heal from it. Let's look at coping with the psychological impacts. First, you have control over the story you tell yourself after an incident of anti-Black hate takes place. It's important to remember that you are not the problem and that your Blackness is not the problem. We also don't want to harbor hate toward the person who committed the anti-Black hate against us either. And so it's important to ensure that we ourselves are telling ourselves helpful stories and not unhelpful stories. For example, an unhelpful story after a moment of anti-Black hate might look like, there's something wrong with me, and I'll never be good enough because of the color of my skin. Their hatred toward me is my fault. But a more helpful story that can actually help you begin to heal psychologically and biologically from what just took place and socially is thinking about something instead like this. My skin is perfect just the way it is. Their hatred towards me has nothing to do with me. I have a rich culture regardless of what someone else thinks about me. Reframing the stories that we tell ourselves is one way that we can promote our wellness in the midst of racial trauma. Given the long history of anti-Black racism and anti-Black hate that we have experienced and continue to experience, and the impact of racial trauma on our bodies and on our minds, it is important that we learn how to cope effectively and move forward toward wellness. Immediately following the incident, your nervous system will likely respond quite quickly. And we saw that in the Mentimeter responses, right? You're feeling scared, you're feeling that fear. And that, again, that's completely normal. Your body is now going to also respond with certain symptoms like the shock, so being in disbelief. You may experience that racing heartbeat. Your palms might get sweaty. You might become hypervigilant, which means you now become hyper aware, like very aware of your circumstances and your surroundings, and you're scanning for other potential threats. You may also get a headache or feel chest pains in your body. Over time, these symptoms can also manifest as depression, low self-esteem, anxiety, poor self-image, and persistent anger that becomes easily triggered. There's things that you can do in the moment to calm down your nervous system to kind of help you cope. One of them is doing a breathing exercise. Breathing is actually very central to our bodies, and it's something that we do all of the time without thinking about it. But breathing and focusing on your breathing intentionally is one way that you can help calm down your nervous system. One activity that I like to do is by closing my eyes, which helps to limit the amount of information that my mind is taking in. And then I just take slow, deep breaths. It's important to inhale through your nose to fill your diaphragm. And then you hold for 3 seconds, and then you would release it out of your mouth. And you would repeat that until you begin to feel those biological symptoms decrease. You can also try grounding exercises. This could look like pausing in the moment once you're in a safe place, naming 5 things you can see and actually saying it out loud, naming 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, and 2 things you can smell. And also thinking about and saying out loud 1 thing that you can taste. This may seem weird, but what you're actually doing is you are causing your brain to no longer be led by the amygdala, that fear center part of your brain. And what you're actually doing is bringing awareness and focus to the front of your brain, which is called your prefrontal cortex, which is the more rational part of your brain, where you reason, where you make decisions, and where you think. And so it slows down your nervous system from believing that you're in danger and trying to essentially help you cope with that moment. And instead, you're now able to realize, okay, I am safe, I'm breathing. Let me think rationally about what to do in this particular moment. Another thing that can be very helpful to you is repeating positive affirmations to yourself. Here's a few positive affirmations that were created, and it's important that you can take these and repeat these positive affirmations to yourself. Some examples are, my life has value and it matters. I am the descendant of greatness and not the image that has been written for me throughout history. I am allowed to feel anger whenever I experience or witness anti-Black hate or violence, and I have the ability to heal. We as people will overcome. These are some of my favorites, but again, I want to hear from you guys. So let's head over to Mentimeter once again, and let's take a few moments just to share and to create some of our own positive affirmations that you yourself might use. Maybe you'll think about some now that you might use if you experience a moment of anti-Black hate in the future. And let's just share them with each other to build community here in this space, even virtually. I like that one right there. I'm strong. And yes, people are sharing in the group. Awesome. So some positive affirmations. When you're building positive affirmations, you want to think about something that builds you up, something that encourages you, maybe something that inspires you about your identity, about your Blackness, or even just about your community. I like that one that I just saw in the chat. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Absolutely. That's one that I personally use. I'm a Christian as well. So Rosalie, you and I are together. I am God's daughter. I like that one too. Thank you for sharing. These are so good. And these are ones that you want, again, you want to make sure that you have them in a place that you can readily bring them back to mind. So sometimes it would be good to, if you have like a memo pad on your phone, write a list of these positive affirmations so that you don't have to think about them in the moment, but you just have to remember, I actually have some positive affirmations. I'm feeling afraid, I'm feeling scared, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling upset that I just experienced this anti-Black hate. But let me actually pull out this memo pad to remind myself of who I really am. I like these that are popping up. I'm kind, I'm smart, and my lived experience is important. Absolutely. The external hate can't affect my internal peace. Ooh, I like that. That one's feeling a little poetic. I like that one. These are so good. I am capable of overcoming any challenges that may come. Absolutely. And remembering that capability is so important. These are great. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. I like that one too. I am beautiful just the way I am. That's so great. These are so good. Maybe take a screenshot so you can keep them and continue to build on them. Let's continue to talk about other ways that we can continue to promote our wellness in the midst of racial trauma. There are 4 additional ways that I want to talk with you about today. The first is to talk about it. A problem shared is a problem half solved. Collective healing can come from sharing our experiences in a trusted community or with a trauma-informed, culturally appropriate, licensed mental health care professional, counselor, or going to therapy. It helps us feel heard and seen, which can help calm our nervous system as well and help us heal some of those, psychological and social impacts of racial trauma that we experience. Another is by focusing on empowerment. So doing what you did today, coming to this presentation, tuning into this webinar, and focusing on ways that you can take control or have a positive influence on your mental and emotional health. It's very important to remind yourself of how beautiful, smart, capable, and handsome you are as a person. Number 3 is reframing our thoughts and our language. In Canada, Black people and people of color are often referred to as minorities. But in fact, people of color are the global majority when you look at the world as a whole. Perspective matters. It's important to celebrate the beauty and resilience of our people and do it often. Lastly, we want to encourage you all to engage in healing self-care practices, which help counteract the impact of stress on the body and on the mind. These are things like listening to music, doing breathing exercises like we previously discussed, even doing mindfulness meditations. You can look these up online, and you can find some even on Spotify or on Apple Music if you use those. And it's also important to practice gratitude, remembering who you are and what you're grateful for. Healing from racial trauma and promoting your wellness in the midst of it is an ongoing and lifelong journey. The impacts of racial trauma did not occur overnight, so healing from its impacts won't happen overnight either. But I hope you now have some tools to help you cope and heal. The goal is to promote our wellness both individually and in community so that we can live healthier lives and thrive in society as we were created to do as we resist and overcome anti-Black hate. As we're about to wrap things up, there's a few key things I want us to remember. Number one is that anti-Black hate is different from anti-Black racism and involves extreme forms of expression or motivation that meet a higher legal threshold of detestation or vilification. It's important to remember that anti-Black hate is not protected by the Charter, not under freedom of speech, and not under freedom of assembly. And so anytime you hear people using those kinds of words and saying, oh, I have the freedom to express, let them know hate is actually not covered. Advocate for yourself and others. Hate crimes are also prohibited by the criminal code. And so it's important that when we experience an incident that we think is a hate crime, or even if it's a hate incident and we're not sure if it'll rise to the level of a hate crime, it's still very important to report it to the police as they keep record of both. Remember that a problem shared is a problem half solved, which means that once you share it with somebody, you're then able to get help. Sharing what you experienced also helps you not internalize what just happened, and instead you can share that with somebody else and they can support you and encourage you and also support you in getting help through that incident. Lastly, it's important to remember that racial trauma does impact us holistically, and it's important that our wellness is also holistic. So think of ways that you can promote your wellness physically, biologically, psychologically, in your mind and how you think, and also socially in your friend group, in your family, or in your communities at large. Knowledge is self-empowerment. Understanding the limits of the freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, as we discussed today, can help promote your self-confidence and facilitate empowerment. It allows you to know with greater certainty when members in society have stepped into criminal territory, and you can then feel more comfortable to report the incident and advocate on behalf of yourself and others. For example, you may have family members or friends that tell you about an incident of anti-Black hate that they experienced. And now, as a result of this presentation, hopefully you are better equipped to help them find support, report the incident, or otherwise advocate for themselves. Or you yourself may witness another Black person becoming the victim of anti-Black hate, or you yourself may experience it, and you can feel more confident in stepping up to support them or yourselves and stopping the encounter from taking place either directly, if it is reasonably safe for you to do so, or indirectly by whatever means are available to you in the moment. At the end of this presentation, there's also a few resources that I would encourage you to check out. One is Charterpedia. It's a website. You can go on Google and look it up. That gives more explanations on your charter rights. There's also a video that looks at how to heal from racial trauma by Dr. Thema Bryant Davis on YouTube. Highly encourage you to watch that video. And ultimately, to continue to build on those positive affirmations, there's also a quick article online called Positive Affirmations for Black Girls, and those can be used to help you continue to create those positive affirmations for yourself, and perhaps you can even find some that you can give to your friends. Thank you for listening, and I'd now like to open up the floor for any questions. Feel free to place your questions in the chat, and myself and the team will do our best to answer them. Thank you so much again for coming today. There's a question. If I'm experiencing a hate crime at work, what are the steps to deal with it? Thank you so much for that question. And the first thing to do would certainly be to report it to your manager or your supervisor. So going back to what we discussed earlier, you want to make sure that you're taking note of the who, the what, the where, and the when. And if this is a coworker, a staff member, or perhaps you're experiencing a hate crime in the environment of your workplace, but it's not by anyone else that you individually work with, it's still important to report that to your manager. And you want to make sure that you're focusing on, like I mentioned, the who, the what, the where, and the when. And you want to emphasize, again, as I mentioned before, just the what the perceived threat to your safety is. So how you're feeling when this person who's perpetuating this hate against you, how it feels. So not only do you want to report it to your manager at your workplace, and stay tuned as well for another presentation that is in our workshop series that's going to be specifically talking about dealing with anti-Black hate in your workplace and what that looks like. That presentation will be coming up soon, so look out for that. But first, you want to report it to them, but you also want to make sure that you're reporting this to the police. So whether an incident of a hate crime takes place in the community, in your neighborhood, or at your work or at your school, you still want to make sure you call the police and report that. So I'm not sure exactly where you are in the world right now, but if you're in the GTA or wherever you are, you can kind of Google what the local police service number is for your area, and you can ensure that you report that incident to the police so that they can keep record of it and also launch an investigation into it. I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions? If not, we will end today's session there. And thank you again so much for participating, for coming. I hope you learned something new. Feel free to share this information with those in your community, and look out for the rest of our webinar series as well.
Right. Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your insights as well, and equipping us with the tools to navigate anti-Black hate. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our partners, Clio, for joining us both in sharing and distributing the information for this session, as well as supporting us behind the scenes as well. Please do stay tuned for the other sessions and workshops and webinars that we have going on in this series as well. But with that, thank you all again for attending today's session, and we look forward to seeing you in our future sessions as well. Take care and have an amazing day.